So you're probably wondering why I called you all here this evening. I love that one. There are so many of those opening lines which I really love, and I will be trying all of them out, I promise you. But for now, we're going to stick with that. Hello, I'm Alasdair. 10 feet to my left is the love of my life, Marguerite, who is also in the chat for you.
Hi.
And welcome, one and all, to the second half of Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. Here's how this normally works. Over on the EA stream, we do a little introduction, catch up with everybody, then the main story, then some shenanigans, and out. Over here, it's done a little bit differently. So, allow myself to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Alasdair. You may know me from the Rusty Quill, where I played Peter Lucas, Martin's mysterious Tai Chi instructor, and the person who always seems to get books out of the library right before John wants them. Rude. Rusty Quill is an entertainment company and podcast network, and we focus on audio drama. We create 3 weekly podcasts, the Magnus Archives, RQ Gaming, and Stellar Firma. I would recommend my favourite to you, but I can't, because they're genuinely all great. This really is a situation where everything this company produces is actually kind of brilliant. You can support Rusty Quill the same way you can support every other desperate, caffeine-soaked creative in the year of our Lord Keanu in 2020, oh god, what now? Which is via direct donation, by subscribing, right here on Twitch, by subscribing through Patreon, and arguably this is the most important one, by telling your friends. 21st century creatives, unless they are people who have a studio behind them, literally live and die by word of mouth. If you like something, which we do, please tell people, because if you tell people, maybe they'll like it too, and if they like it, they'll tell more people, and before you know it, Johnny Big Streams really has taken over the world, which I'm fairly certain he's well on the way towards anyway, and I for one welcome it.
Just over there. Just over there.
Just over there. So, that opening monologue I told you about, here's why we do that. Basically, it's an excuse for you to get comfortable. Get a drink, hydrate. If you're eating a food or you need a food, get one. If you need to take some meds, take them. If you need to get comfy, do that. If you have pets to feed, do that. Just consider this as that bit in the cinema, the place we will all go one day again, quite soon I'm sure, where you're watching the trailers and people are coming in and getting comfy. Also, as Cato says, hydrate, but do not dehydrate. Also, I serve you fair warning. There is a long and proud tradition amongst these monologues of me not being able to get through them with a straight face. And I see no reason why this week should be any different.
Content warning, corpsing.
Content warning, corpsing.
Wendy, start the clock.
And accent. Werner Herzog's Nod to His Cleaning Lady by Dale Shaw. Rosalina, woman, you constantly revile me with your singular lack of vision. Be aware there is an essential truth and beauty in all things, from the death throes of a speared gazelle to the damaged smile of a freeway homeless. But that does not mean that the invisibility of something implies its lack of being. Those simpleton babies foolishly believe the person before them vanishes when they cover their eyes during a hateful game of peekaboo. This is a fallacy. And so it is that the unseen dusty buildup that accumulates behind the DVD shelves in the rumpus room exists also. This is unacceptable. I will tell you this, Rosalina, not as a taunt or a threat, but as an evocation of joy. The joy of nothing. It's going well. The joy of the real. I want you to be real in everything you do. If you cannot be real, then a semblance of reality must be maintained. A real semblance of the fake real, or real. I have conquered volcanoes. I have visited the bitter depths of the Earth's oceans. Nothing.
Does that count as 1 or 2?
Nothing I have witnessed, from lava to crustacean, assailed me like the caked debris haunting that soul.
Come on, you can do it. Start with the other guy witnessed. Now you're corpsing in the fact that they're doing a corpse count. This is glorious.
Assailed me like the caked debris haunting that small plastic soap hammock in the smaller of the bathrooms. Nausea is not a sufficient word. In this regard, you are not being real. Now we must turn to the horrors of nature. I am afraid this is inevitable. Nature is not something to be coddled and accepted and held to your bosom like a wounded snake. Tell me, what was there before you were born? What do you remember? That is nature. Nature is a void, an emptiness, a vacuum. One moment. And speaking of vacuum...
It sounds like an ad!
I am not sure you're using the retractable nozzle correctly, or... or applying the full left setting when attending to the lush carpets of the den. I found some dander there. I have only... Pardon me. Bogov is no 13, at least 15.
No.
I have only listened to 2 songs in my entire life. One was an aria by Wagner. Okay, it's maybe 13. That I played compulsively from the ages of 19 to 27, at least 60 times a day, until the local townsfolk drove me from my dwelling using rudimentary pitchforks and blazing torches. The other was Dido. Both appalled me to the point of paralysis. Every quaver was like a brickbat against my soul. Music is futile and malicious, so please, if you require entertainment while organizing the recycling, refrain from the pop radio I was affronted by recently. May I recommend the recitation of some sharp verse, perhaps by Goethe or Schiller or Shel Silverstein at a push? The situation regarding spoons...
You have to do the whole line.
The situation regarding spoons remains...
Try again.
I'm getting there. It's going well. The situation regarding spoons remains unchanged. If I see one, I will kill it. That is all. Do not fail to think that you are not the finest woman I have ever met. You are, and I am including on this list my mother and the wife... Okay. I am on this list my mother and the wife of Brad Dourif, the second wife, not the one with the lip thing. Thank you for listening, and sorry if parts of this note were smudged. I have been weeping. Welcome to the show.
There's 2 more lines there.
I'm sorry. I have been weeping. Your money is under the guillotine. Herzog. I love that so much. So very, very much. Oh, hello everyone. Yes, that was the monologue. For those of you who are curious about whether that was intended, all of it was. Werner Herzog is a legendary film director, and I encourage you to check the pages I'll be putting in the show notes about his films. You will not believe some of the things he's done. Neither does he. You will know him best of all in one of 2 possible ways. The first is, somehow, he was the villain in the first Jack Reacher movie. I'm increasingly convinced he was just wandering by the set and they tranked him like an errant Tyrannosaurus. And secondly, he's in The Mandalorian. Werner is the person who hires Mando to go and get the child. Hence, bounty hunting is a complicated profession. Wouldn't you agree? I have no idea why he keeps showing up in these super mainstream projects, but I'm so happy he does, because Werner is 150,000% intense.
Cave of Forgotten Dreams.
Cave of Forgotten Dreams, the best 3D movie ever made about the cave paintings discovered in France. 3/4 of it is an incredibly well put together and technically brilliant documentary about the cave paintings and what we know about the people who made them. The last 10 minutes is Werner getting a little bit overexcited and talking about albino alligators born in nuclear reactors. He is a lot. Yes, Rick and Morty also. Werner's a lot. And I find him and his incredible, relentless intensity incredibly funny. This is the guy who, when the Mandalorian production staff were panicking over the fact that the child was a puppet and started thinking about CGI, who apparently stalked up to them, looked them straight in the eye, and went, "You are cowards. The puppet stays." He's amazing and terrifying. So, that was Werner. Now let's talk about bread. For those of you who join us regularly on the Escape Artist stream on Wednesday night, you will be very well acquainted with Chungus. Chungus is our sourdough starter. This is Chungus. Fear or milkshake. What you will not be well acquainted with is the fact that Chungus has some costuming. And thanks to Wendell's, who's in the chat tonight.
We're opening this live.
This is live. We are literally doing this live.
Hold it up so they can see. And yes, that is his little birthday pin.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, it's my birthday this weekend.
And his folks sent him a "I'm a birthday boy" pin. I'm very excited about this.
Okay, so we have. Oh my god, Wendy, it's lined.
Oh my gosh. Okay, show the chat.
Okay, it's a vampire cape for Chungus.
And it has a little cummerbund. Okay, hold on a second. Let me get Chungus dressed. I can't believe that I just said that right on chat. Hold on.
Wendy,
oh my gosh.
This is incredible.
Hold on. Vamp. I'm dressing the sourdough starter.
This is what happens in my life now. I have to vamp as the sourdough starter is being dressed. I love
wardrobe change. Oh my gosh, he's so adorable. I have to put it up top though so it pops up. There we go. Oh, that's my front door. Please excuse us. Show off Chungus while I enter the front door.
Look at him. Look at his massive fin whatnots. Look at his collar. This is incredible. Wendy, you have excelled yourself even beyond your usual extraordinary levels. He's so good. He is a Vampungus. Thank you, Hester. Hester has successfully named him Vampungus.
Vampungus? Okay.
Vampungus.
And we have to also show off the
Yes. We regret nothing.
Okay.
So, that's Chungus. That is Chungus's spectacular new outfit. Thank you so much for that, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy. It's adorable.
Let's catch up a little bit. What's been going on? Well, like I say, it's my birthday this weekend, so we've been doing a lot of birthday-related stuff. Most of which today has involved...
Chunkula! Oh, Chunkula's a great
Chunkula's
name.
even better. Most of which today has involved donuts, which have been fantastic. I had a matcha donut from Crosstown, who now deliver countrywide, and for a while I could see math. It was great. So we've done that. We have all kinds of birthday stuff prepped for later on over the weekend. My parents, who oddly enough know me quite well, sent this. Oh yeah.
I have to take a picture of Chungus for the Twitter thread.
There is a picture of Chungus going on the Twitter thread as we speak, or about to be.
Let's see if I can get the lighting. Keep talking. You're good.
Exactly. And we're actually, this sounds weird, which is not great when you think about it. We're actually taking a long weekend off because we've been going absolutely flat out for a really long time. And my birthday is a really good excuse to not do that. And I say that as someone who did about 3 hours of work today anyway. Marguerite did about 4.
And we took the recycling out because you have all been terribly generous in delivering
Thank you
birthday
so
presents,
much.
And the house is becoming overrun by Amazon boxes.
And also by pumpkins, because it's pumpkin season on Animal Crossing.
Pumpkins! Exactly.
So that's where we are.
Let's do a story recap.
Let's do a story recap. We are reading Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, which is the vampire story that hits before Dracula does. And Le Fanu is a really interesting cat. We'll get into this a little bit in the end cap, because I'm treating this kind of like a pseudopod story. Pseudopod is my day job. It's a horror fiction podcast where every week I introduce a story. A story is narrated by someone else, and I come on at the other end and go, ooh, boogity boogity, just with more words and occasional jokes. The history of Le Fanu and the history of what he kind of pushed into horror main currents is fascinating. Carmilla itself is basically a story about a young woman who lives in a castle in the middle of the countryside with her father and her two servants, and is extremely upset when the closest thing she has to a friend, who is someone who lives several miles away, just dies. And then, in a deeply... Oh, no, I have not read the Vampire Archives, and I really should. Thank you for that. I'll look that up. And in a deeply suspicious incident, a carriage accidentally has a non-fatal accident directly outside while everyone is outside one night. And a woman who is in a tremendous hurry hops out and goes, I have to keep going because I cannot stop my journey for anything. My daughter is unconscious. Please tell me the nearest inn where I could drop her for 3 months. And because Carmilla's... Because chivalry. Because the main character's father, who has not read the type of book he is a character in, then goes, oh no, she must stay with us. Immediately weird things ensue. These two young women become very close in a manner only one of them is comfortable with. There are very strong romantic overtones to the relationship going in one way. And they both dreamt of one another when they were children.
Because that's not creepy.
So that's pretty much where we are. Here's how this is going to work. This is quite a weighty story. We actually, in terms of time length, we actually did slightly more than half the first time, so this won't take quite as long, but there will be a break in the middle of it. That really functions in two different ways. The first one is it gives me an excuse to neck another cup of tea Earl Grey hot to keep my voice in check, and it gives you a chance to take a comfort break, grab some hydration, whatever you need. So... Oh, Zalia, thank you for pointing out, yes, the Halloween parade for Pseudopod does have a moment with a couple of very familiar archive staff and a certain sea captain. And then we'll round it off, and then there will be the shenanigan. Oh, yes. So, if everybody is set and ready, we will begin.
Content warnings?
Content warnings galore. This is a Victorian story. I mean, that really is almost enough just by itself. But content warnings, battle scenes, decapitation, racist and fat-shaming descriptions, accents. And with all of that in mind, let's begin. A significant tea sip. Chapter 8. Search. At sight of the room, perfectly undisturbed except for our violent entrance, we began to cool a little, and soon recovered our senses sufficiently to dismiss the men. It had struck Mademoiselle that possibly Carmilla had been wakened by the uproar at her door, and, in her first panic, had jumped from her bed and hid herself in a press, or behind a curtain, from which she could not, of course, emerge, until the major domo and his myrmidons had withdrawn. We now recommenced our search, and began to call her name again. It was all to no purpose. Our perplexity and agitation increased. We examined the windows, but they were secured. I implored of Carmilla, if she had concealed herself to play this cruel trick no longer, to come out and to end our anxieties. It was all useless. I was, by this time, convinced that she was not in the room, nor in the dressing room, the door of which was still locked on this side. She could not have passed it. I was utterly puzzled. Had Carmilla discovered one of those secret passages which the old housekeeper said were known to exist in the Schloss, although the tradition of their exact situation had been lost? A little time would, no doubt, explain all. Utterly perplexed, as for the present, we were. It was past 4 o'clock, and I preferred passing the remaining hours of darkness in Madame's room. Daylight brought no solution of the difficulty. The whole household, with my father at its head, was in a state of agitation next morning. Every part of the chateau was searched. The grounds were explored. No trace of the missing lady was discovered. The stream was about to be dragged. My father was in distraction. What a tale to have to tell the poor girl's mother on her return. I, too, was almost beside myself, though my grief was quite of a different kind. The morning was passed in alarm and excitement. It was now 1 o'clock, and still no tidings. I ran up to Carmilla's room and found her standing at her dressing table. I was astounded. I could not believe my eyes. She beckoned to me with her pretty finger in silence. Her face expressed extreme fear. I ran to her in an ecstasy of joy. I kissed and embraced her again and again. I ran to the bell and rang it vehemently to bring others to the spot who might at once relieve my father's anxiety. "Dear Carmilla, what has become of you all this time? We have been in agonies of anxiety about you," I exclaimed. "Where have you been? How did you come back?" "Last night has been a night of wonders," she said. "For mercy's sake, explain all you can." "It was past 2 last night," she said, "when I went to sleep as usual in my bed with my doors locked, that of the dressing room and that opening upon the gallery. My sleep was uninterrupted and, so far as I know, dreamless, but I woke just now on the sofa in the dressing room there, and I found the door between the rooms open and the other door forced. How could all this have happened without my being wakened? It must have been accompanied with a great deal of noise, and I am particularly easily wakened, and how could I have been carried out of my bed without my sleep having been interrupted, I, whom the slightest stir startles?" By this time, Madame, Mademoiselle, my father, and a number of the servants were in the room. Carmilla was, of course, overwhelmed with inquiries, congratulations, and welcomes. She had but one story to tell, and seemed the least able of all the party to suggest any way of accounting for what had happened. My father took a turn up and down the room, thinking. I saw Carmilla's eyes follow him for a moment with a sly, dark glance. When my father had sent the servants away, Mademoiselle having gone in search of a little bottle of valerian and salvatile, and there now being no one in the room with Carmilla except my father, Madame, and myself, he came to her thoughtfully, took her hand very kindly, led her to the sofa, and sat down beside her. "Will you forgive me, my dear, if I risk a conjecture and ask a question?" "Who can have a better right?" she said. "Ask what you please, and I will tell you everything, but my story is simply one of bewilderment and darkness. I knew absolutely nothing. I know absolutely nothing. Put any question you please, but you know, of course, the limitations Mamma has placed me under." "Perfectly, my dear child. I need not approach the topics on which she desires our silence. Now, the marvel of last night consisted in your having been removed from your bed and your room without being wakened, and this removal having occurred apparently while the windows were still secured and the 2 doors locked upon the inside. I will tell you my theory, and I will ask you a question." Carmilla was leaning on her hand dejectedly. Madame and I were listening breathlessly. "Now, my question is this. Have you ever been suspected of walking in your sleep?" "Never, since I was very young indeed." "But you did walk in your sleep when you were young?" "Yes, I know I did. I have been told so often by my old nurse." My father smiled and nodded. "Well, what has happened is this. You got up in your sleep, unlocked the door, not leaving the key as usual in the lock, but taking it out and locking it on the outside. You again took the key out and carried it with you to some one of the 25 rooms on this floor, or perhaps upstairs, or downstairs. There are so many rooms and closets, so much heavy furniture, such accumulations of lumber, that it would require a week to search this old house thoroughly. Do you see, now, what I mean?" "I do, but not all," she answered. "And how, Papa, do you account for her finding herself on the sofa in the dressing room, which we had searched so carefully?" "She came there after you had searched it, still in her sleep, and at last awoke spontaneously, and was as much surprised to find herself where she was as anyone else. I wish all mysteries were as easily and innocently explained as yours, Carmilla," he said, laughing, "and so we may congratulate ourselves on the certainty that the most natural explanation of the occurrence is one that involves no drugging, no tampering with locks, no burglars or poisoners or witches, nothing that need alarm Carmilla or anyone else for our safety." Carmilla was looking charmingly. Nothing could be more beautiful than her tints. Her beauty was, I think, enhanced by that graceful languor that was peculiar to her. I think my father was silently contrasting her looks with mine. For he said, "I wish my poor Laura was looking more like herself," and he sighed. So our alarms were happily ended, and Carmilla restored to her friends. Chapter 9. The Doctor. Carmilla would not hear of an attendant sleeping in her room, so my father arranged that a servant should sleep outside her door so that she would not attempt to make another such excursion without being arrested at her own door. That night passed quietly, and next morning, early, the doctor, whom my father had sent for without telling me a word about it, arrived to see me. Madame accompanied me to the library, and there the grave little doctor, with white hair and spectacles, whom I had mentioned before, was waiting to receive me. I told him my story, and as I proceeded, he grew graver and graver. We were standing, he and I, in the recess of one of the windows, facing one another. When my statement was over, he leaned with his shoulders against the wall, and with his eyes fixed on me earnestly, with an interest in which was a dash of horror. After a minute's reflection, he asked Madame if he could see my father. He was sent for accordingly, and as he entered, smiling, he said, "I dare say, Doctor, you're going to tell me I'm an old fool for having brought you here. I hope I am." But his smile faded into shadow as the doctor, with a very grave face, beckoned him to him. He and the doctor talked for some time in the same recess where I had just conferred with the physician. It seemed an earnest and argumentative conversation. The room is very large, and I and Madame stood together, burning with curiosity, at the farther end. Not a word could we hear, however, for they spoke in a very low tone, and the deep recess of the window quite concealed the doctor from view, and very nearly my father, whose foot, arm, and shoulder only could we see. The voices were, I suppose, all the less audible for the sort of closet which the thick wall and window formed. After a time, my father's face looked into the room. It was pale, thoughtful, and, I fancied, agitated. "Laura, dear, come here for a moment. Madame, we shan't trouble you, the doctor says at present." Accordingly, I approached, for the first time a little alarmed, for although I felt very weak, I did not feel ill, and strength, one always fancies, is a thing that may be picked up when we please. My father held out his hand to me as I drew near, but he was looking at the doctor, and he said, "It certainly is very odd. I don't understand it quite. Laura, come here, my dear. Now, attend to Dr. Spielsberg, and recollect yourself." "You mentioned a sensation like that of two needles piercing the skin, somewhere about your neck, on the night when you experienced your first horrible dream. Is there still any soreness?" "None at all," I answered. "Can you indicate with your finger about the point at which you think this occurred?" "Very little below my throat, here," I answered. I wore a morning dress, which covered the place I pointed to. "Now, can you satisfy yourself?" "Pardon me, now, you can satisfy yourself," said the doctor. "You won't mind your papa's lowering your dress a very little. It is necessary to detect a symptom of the complaint under which you have been suffering." I acquiesced. It was only an inch or two below the edge of my collar. "God bless me, so it is!" exclaimed my father, growing pale. "You see it now with your own eyes," said the doctor with a gloomy triumph. "What is it?" I exclaimed, beginning to be frightened. "Nothing, my dear young lady, but a small blue spot, about the size of the tip of your little finger. And now," he continued, turning to Papa, "the question is, what is best to be done?" "Is there any danger?" I urged in great trepidation. "I trust not, my dear," answered the doctor. "I don't see why you should not recover. I don't see why you should not begin immediately to get better. That is the point at which the sense of strangulation begins. Yes, I answered, and recollect as well as you can, the same point was a kind of centre of that thrill which you described just now, like the current of a cold stream running against you. It may have been. I think it was. Aha! You see, he turned to my father again. Shall I say a word to Madame? Certainly, said my father. He called Madame to him and said, I find my young friend here far from well. It won't be of any great consequence, I hope, but it will be necessary that some steps be taken, which I will explain by and by. But in the meantime, Madame, you will be so good as to not let Miss Laura be alone for one moment. That is the only direction I need give for the present. It is indispensable. We may rely upon your kindness, Madame, I know, added my father. Madame satisfied him eagerly. And you too, dear Laura, I know you will observe the doctor's direction. I shall have to ask your opinion about another patient, whose symptoms slightly resemble those of my daughter that have just been detailed to you. Very much milder in degree, but I believe quite of the same sort. She is a young lady, our guest, but as you say, you will be passing this way again this evening. You can't do better than take your supper here, and you can then see her. She does not come down till the afternoon. I thank you, said the doctor. I shall be with you then at about 7 this evening. And then they repeated the directions to me and Madame, and with this parting charge, my father left us and walked out with the doctor, and I saw them pacing together up and down between the road and the moat on the grassy platform in front of the castle, evidently absorbed in earnest conversation. The doctor did not return. I saw him mount his horse there, take his leave, and ride away eastward through the forest. Nearly at the same time, I saw the man arrive from Tranfield with the letters, and dismount and hand the bag to my father. In the meantime, Madame and I were both busy, lost in conjecture as to the reasons of the singular and earnest direction which the doctor and my father had concurred in imposing. Madame, as she afterwards told me, was afraid the doctor apprehended a sudden seizure, and that without prompt assistance I may either lose my life in a fit, or at the very least be seriously hurt. The interpretation did not strike me, and I fancied, perhaps luckily for my nerves, that the arrangement was prescribed simply to secure a companion, who would prevent my taking too much exercise, or eating unripe fruit, or doing any of the 50 foolish things to which young people are supposed to be prone. About half an hour after my father came in, he had a letter in his hand and said, This letter has been delayed. It is from General Spielsdorf. He might have been here yesterday, but he may not come till tomorrow, or he may be here today. He put the open letter into my hand, but he did not look pleased, as he used to when a guest, especially one so much loved as the General, was coming. On the contrary, he looked as if he wished him at the bottom of the Red Sea. There was plainly something on his mind which he did not choose to divulge. Papa, darling, will you tell me this? Said I, suddenly laying my hand on his arm and looking, I am sure, imploringly in his face. Perhaps, he answered, smoothing my hair caressingly over my eyes. Does the doctor think me very ill? No, dear, no. He thinks if right steps are taken, you will be quite well again, at least on the high road to a complete recovery in a day or two, he answered, a little dryly. I wish our good friend the General had chosen any other time. That is, I wish you had been perfectly well to receive him. But do tell me, Papa, I insisted. What does he think is the matter with me? Nothing. You just must not plague me with questions, he answered with more irritation than I ever remember him to have displayed before. And seeing that I looked wounded, I suppose, he kissed me and added, You shall know all about it in a day or two. That is all that I know. In the meantime, you are not to trouble your head about it. He turned and left the room, but came back before I had done wondering and puzzling over the oddity of all this. It was merely to say that he was going to Karnstein, and had ordered the carriage to be ready at 12, and that I and Madame should accompany him. He was going to see the priest, who lived near those picturesque grounds, upon business, and as Carmilla had never seen them, she could follow when she came down with Mademoiselle, who would bring materials for what you would call the picnic, which might be laid out for us in the ruined castle. At 12 o'clock, Accordingly, I was ready, and not long after, my father, Madame, and I set out upon our projected drive. Passing the drawbridge, we turned to the right and followed the road over the steep Gothic bridge westward to reach the deserted village and ruined castle of Karnstein. No sylvan drive can be fancied prettier. The ground breaks into gentle hills and hollows, all clothed with beautiful wood, totally destitute of the comparative formality which artificial planting and early culture and pruning impart. The irregularities of the ground often lead the road out of its course and cause it to wind beautifully round the sides of broken hollows and the steeper sides of the hills, among varieties of ground almost inexhaustible. Turning one of these points, we suddenly encountered our old friend, the General, riding towards us, attended by a mounted servant, whose portmanteaus were following in a hired wagon, such as we term a cart. The General dismounted as we pulled up, and after the usual greetings, was easily persuaded to accept the vacant seat in the carriage and send his horse on with his servant to the Schloss and to the significant tea.
How fortuitous.
How fortuitous, and not at all dubious in the slightest. By the way, thank you for diagnosed with sapphic pining.
You're welcome.
There we are. 10. Bereaved. It was about 10 months since we had last seen him, but at that time he had sufficed to make an alteration of years in his appearance. He had grown thinner, something of gloom and anxiety had taken the place of that cordial serenity which used to characterize his features. His dark blue eyes, always penetrating, now gleamed with a sterner light from under his shaggy grey eyebrows. It was not such a change as grief alone usually induces, and angrier passions seemed to have had their share in bringing it about. We had not long resumed our drive when the General began to talk, with his usual soldierly directness, of the bereavement, as he termed it, which he had sustained in the death of his beloved niece and ward, and he then broke out in a tone of intense bitterness and fury, inveighing against the hellish arts to which he had fallen a victim, and expressing, with more exasperation than piety, his wonder that heaven should tolerate so monstrous an indulgence of the lusts and malignity of hell. My father, who saw at once that something very extraordinary had befallen, asked him, if not too painful to him, to detail the circumstances which he thought justified these strong terms in which he expressed himself. "I should tell you all with pleasure," said the General, "but you wouldn't believe me." "And why should I not?" he asked. "Because," he answered testily, "you believe in nothing but what consists with your own prejudices and illusions. I remember when I was like you. I've learned better." "Try me," said my father. "I am not such a dogmatist as you suppose. Besides which, I very well know that you generally require proof for what you believe, and am therefore very strongly predisposed to respect your conclusions. You are right in supposing that I have not been led lightly into a belief in the marvellous, for what I have experienced is marvellous, and I have been forced by extraordinary evidence to credit that which I encounter diametrically to all my theories. I have been made the dupe of a preternatural conspiracy." Notwithstanding his professions of confidence in the General's penetration, I saw my father, at this point, glance at the General with, as I thought, a marked suspicion of his sanity. The General did not see it, luckily. He was looking gloomily and curiously into the glades and vistas of the woods that were opening before us. "You are going to the ruins of Karnstein," he said. "Yeah. It's a lucky coincidence. Do you know I was going to ask you to bring me there to inspect them? I have a special object in exploring. There is a ruined chapel, isn't there, with a great many tombs of that extinct family." "So there are. Highly interesting," said my father. "I hope you are thinking of claiming the title and estates." My father said this gaily, but the General did not recollect the laugh, or even the smile which courtesy exacts for a friend's joke. On the contrary, he looked grave and even fierce, ruminating on a matter that stirred his anger and horror. "Something very different," he said gruffly. "I mean to unearth some of these fine people. I hope, by God's blessing, to accomplish a pious sacrilege here, which will relieve our earth of certain monsters, and enable honest people to sleep in their beds without being assailed by murderers. I have strange things to tell you, my dear friend, such as I myself would have scouted as incredible just a few months since. My father looked at him again, but this time not with a glance of suspicion, with an eye rather of keen intelligence and alarm. The house of Karnstein, he said, has long been extinct. 100 years at least. My dear wife was maternally descended from the Karnsteins, but the name and title have long ceased to exist. The castle is a ruin, the very village deserted. It is 50 years since the smoke of a chimney was seen there. There isn't a roof left. Quite true. I've heard a great deal about that since I last saw you. A great deal that will astonish you. But I had better relate everything in the order in which it occurred, said the General. You saw my dear ward, my child, I may call her. No creature could have been more beautiful, and only 3 months ago no more blooming. Yes, poor thing. When I saw her last, she certainly was quite lovely, said my father. I was grieved and shocked more than I could tell you, my dear friend. I know what a blow it was to you. He took the General's hand and they exchanged a kind pressure. Tears gathered in the old soldier's eyes, and he did not seek to conceal them. He said, We have been very old friends. I knew you would feel for me, childless as I am. She had become an object of very near interest to me, and she repaid my care by an affection that cheered my home and made my life happy. That is all gone. The years that remain to me on earth may not be very long, but by God's mercy I hope to accomplish a service to mankind before I die, and to subserve the vengeance of heaven upon the fiends who have murdered my poor child in the spring of her hopes and beauty. You said just now that you intended relating everything as it occurred, said my father. Pray do. I assure you that it is not mere curiosity that prompts me. By this time we had reached the point at which the Drunstall road, by which the General had come, diverges from the road which we were travelling to Karnstein. How far is it to the ruins? Inquired the General, looking anxiously forward. About half a league, answered my father. Pray, let us hear the story you were so good as to promise. Thank you for honk pyre. I have albums by the exchanged kind pressure, I'm quite sure. Chapter 11. The story. With all my heart, said the General, with an effort, and after a short pause in which to arrange his subject, he commenced one of the strangest narratives I have ever heard. My dear child was looking forward with great pleasure to the visit you had been so good as to arrange for her, to your charming daughter. Here he made me a gallant but melancholy bow. In the meantime, we had an invitation to my old friend the Count Carsfield, whose schloss is about 6 leagues to the other side of Karnstein. It was to attend a series of fetes, which you remember were given by him in honour of his illustrious visitor, the Grand Duke Charles. Yes, very splendid, I believe they were, said my father, princely. But then his hospitalities are quite regal. He has Aladdin's lamp. The night from which my sorrow dates was devoted to a magnificent masquerade. The grounds were thrown open, the trees hung with coloured lamps. There was such a display of fireworks as Paris herself had never witnessed, and such music. Music, you know, is my weakness. Such ravishing music. The finest instrumental band perhaps in the world, and the finest singers who could be collected from all the great operas in Europe. As you wandered through these fantastically illuminated grounds, the moonlighted chateau throwing a rosy light from its long rows of windows, you would suddenly hear these ravishing voices stealing from the silence of some grove, or rising from boats upon the lake. I felt myself, as I looked and listened, carried back into the romance and the poetry of my early youth. When the fireworks were ended, and the ball beginning, We returned to the noble suite of rooms that were thrown open to the dancers. A masked ball, is a beautiful sight, but so brilliant a spectacle of the kind I never saw before. It was a very aristocratic assembly. I was myself almost the only nobody present. My dear child was looking so beautiful. She wore no mask. Her excitement and delight added an unspeakable charm to her features, which were always lovely. I remarked a young lady, dressed magnificently but wearing a mask, who appeared to me to be observing my ward with extraordinary interest. I'd seen her, earlier in the evening, in the great hall, and again for a few minutes walking near us on the terrace, under the castle windows, similarly employed. A lady, also masked, richly and gravely dressed, and with a stately air like a person of rank, accompanied her as a chaperone. Had the young lady not worn a mask, I could, of course, have been much more certain upon the question whether she was really watching my poor darling, and I am now well assured that she was. We were in one of the salons. My poor dear child had been dancing, and I was resting a little in one of the chairs near the door. I was standing near. The two ladies I have mentioned had approached, and the younger took the chair next to my ward while her companion stood beside me, and for a little time addressed herself in a low tone to her charge. Availing herself of the privilege of a mask, she turned to me, and in the tone of an old friend and calling me by my name, opened a conversation with me. Piqued my curiosity a good deal. She referred to many scenes where she'd met me, at court, at distinguished houses. She alluded to little incidents which I had long ceased to think of, but which I found had only lain in abeyance in my memory, for they instantly started into life at her touch. I became more and more curious to ascertain who she was every moment. She parried my attempts to discover very adroitly, very pleasantly. The knowledge she showed of many passages in my life seemed to me all but unaccountable, and she appeared to take a not unnatural pleasure in foiling my curiosity, and in seeing me flounder in my eager perplexity from one conjecture to another. In the meantime, the young lady whom my mother had called by the odd name of Millarca, when she once or twice addressed her, had, with the same ease and grace, got into conversation with my ward. She introduced herself by saying that her mother was a very old acquaintance of mine. She spoke of the agreeable audacity which a mask rendered practicable. She talked like a friend. She admired her dress, insinuated very prettily her admiration of her beauty. She amused her with laughing criticisms upon the people who crowded the ballroom, and laughed at my poor child's fun. She was very witty, very lively when she pleased, and after a time they grew very good friends, and the young stranger lowered her mask, displaying a remarkably beautiful face. I'd never seen it before. Neither had my dear child, but though as it was new to us, the features were so engaging, as well as lovely, that it was impossible not to feel the attraction powerfully. My poor girl did so. I never saw anyone more taken with another at first sight, unless, indeed, it was the stranger herself, who seemed to have quite lost her art to her. In the meantime, availing myself of the license of a masquerade, I put not a few questions to the older lady. "You've puzzled me utterly," I said, laughing. "Is that not enough? Won't you now consent to stand on equal terms and do me the kindness to remove your mask?" "Can any request be more unreasonable?" she replied. "Ask a lady to yield an advantage. Besides, how do you know you should recognize me? Years make changes." "As you see," I said with a bow, and I suppose a rather melancholy little laugh. "As philosophers tell us," she said, "and how do you know that a sight of my face would help you?" "I should take a chance for that," I answered. "It is vain trying to make yourself out an old woman. Your figure betrays you." "Years, nevertheless, have passed since I saw you, rather since you saw me. For that is what I am considering. Millarca there is my daughter. I cannot then be young, even in the opinion of people whom time has taught to be indulgent, and I may not like to be compared with what you remember me. You have no mask to remove. You can offer me nothing in exchange. My petition is to your pity to remove it, and mine to yours to let it stay where it is, she replied. Well then, at least you tell me whether you're French or German. You speak both languages so perfectly. I don't think I shall tell you that, General. You intend a surprise, and are meditating the particular point of attack. At all events, you won't deny this, I said, that being honoured by your permission to converse, I ought to know how to address you. Shall I say Madame la Comtesse? She laughed, and she would no doubt have met me with another evasion, if indeed I can treat any occurrence in an interview, every circumstance of which was prearranged, as I now believe, with the profoundest cunning, as liable to be modified by accident. As to that, she began, but she was interrupted almost as she opened her lips by a gentleman dressed in black who looked particularly elegant and distinguished, with this drawback, that his face was the most deadly pale I've ever seen except in death. He was in no masquerade, in the plain evening dress of a gentleman, and he said, without a smile but with a courtly and unusually low bow, Will Madame la Comtesse permit me to say a very few words which may interest her? The lady turned quickly to him and touched her lip in token of silence. She then said to me, Keep my place for me, General. I shall return when I have said a few words. And with this injunction, playfully given, she walked a little aside with the gentleman in black and talked for some minutes, apparently very earnestly. They then walked away slowly together in the crowd, and I lost them for some time. I spent the interval in cudgelling my brains for a conjecture as to the identity of the lady, who seemed to remember me so kindly, and I was thinking of turning about and joining in the conversation between my pretty ward and the Countess's daughter, and trying whether, by the time she returned, I might not have a surprise in store for her by having a name, title, chateau, and estates at my fingers' ends. But at this moment she returned, accompanied by the pale man in black, who said, I shall return and inform Madame la Comtesse when her carriage is at the door. He withdrew with a bow. And on to chapter 12. That's some significant tea.
There's been a question if you would share which birthday this is coming up.
Yes, of course. This is my 44th.
Cool. Sorry to interrupt.
That's quite all right. Just for a second, it was like 10th. 10. For the fourth time.
7, 5, 12.
Shut up. 12. A petition. Then we ought to lose Madame la Comtesse, but I hope only for a few hours, I said with a low bow. It may be that only, or it may be a few weeks. It was very unlucky his speaking to me just now as he did. Do you now know me? I assured her I did not. You shall know me, she said, but not at present. We are older and better friends than perhaps you suspect. I cannot yet declare myself. I shall, in 3 weeks, pass your beautiful Schloss, about which I have been making inquiries. I shall then look in upon you for an hour or two, and renew a friendship which I never think of without 1,000 pleasant recollections. This moment a piece of news has reached me like a thunderbolt. I must set out now and travel by a devious route, nearly 100 miles, with all the dispatch I can possibly make. My perplexities multiply. I am only deterred by the compulsory reserve I practice as to my name from making a very singular request of you. My poor child has not quite recovered her strength. Her horse fell with her at a hunt which she had ridden out to witness. Her nerves have not yet recovered the shock, and our physician says that she must not, on any account, exert herself for some time to come. We came here, in consequence, by very easy stages, hardly 6 leagues a day. I must now travel day and night on a mission of life and death. a mission the critical and momentous nature of which I shall be able to explain to you when we meet, as I hope we shall, in a few weeks, without the necessity of any concealment. She went on to make a petition, and it was in the tone of a person from whom such a request amounted to conferring rather than seeking a favour. That was only in manner, and as it seemed quite unconsciously. Then the terms in which it was expressed, nothing could be more deprecatory. It was simply that I would consent to take charge of her daughter during her absence. This was, all things considered, a strange, not to say an audacious request. She in some sort disarmed me by stating and admitting everything that could be urged against it, and throwing herself entirely upon my chivalry. My chivalry. At the same moment, by a fatality that seems to have predetermined all that happened, my poor child came to my side and in an undertone besought me to invite her new friend Malaka to pay us a visit. She had just been sounding her and thought, if her mamma would allow her, she would like it extremely. At another time, I should have told her to wait a little until at least we knew who they were, but I had not a moment to think in. The two ladies assailed me together, and I must confess the refined and beautiful face of the young lady, about which there was something extremely engaging, as well as the elegance and fire of eye birth, determined me, and quite overpowered I submitted, and undertook too easily, the care of the young lady whom my mother called Milaka. The Countess beckoned to her daughter, who listened with grave attention while she told her in general terms how suddenly and peremptorily she had been summoned, and also of the arrangement she had made for her under my care, adding that I was one of her earliest and most valued friends. I made, of course, such speeches as the case seemed to call for, found myself on reflection in a position which I did not half like. The gentleman in black returned, and very ceremoniously conducted the lady from the room. The demeanour of this gentleman was such as to impress me with the conviction that the Countess was a lady of very much more importance than her modest title alone might have led me to assume. A last charge to me was that no attempt was to be made to learn more about her than I might have already guessed until her return. Our distinguished host, whose guest she was, knew her reasons. But here, she said, neither I nor my daughter could safely remain for more than a day. I removed my mask imprudently for a moment about an hour ago, and too late I fancied you saw me. So I resolved to seek an opportunity of talking a little to you. Had I found that you had seen me, I would have thrown myself on your high sense of honour to keep my secret some weeks. As it is, I am satisfied that you did not see me, but if you now suspect, or on reflection should suspect, who I am, I commit myself in like manner entirely to your honour. My daughter will observe the same secrecy, and I well know that you will, from time to time, remind her lest she should thoughtlessly disclose it. She whispered a few words to her daughter, kissed her hurriedly twice, then went away, accompanied by the pale gentleman in black, disappearing into the crowd. In the next room, said Malaka, there is a window that looks upon the hall door. I should like to see the last of Mamma, and to kiss my hand to her. We assented. Of course we assented, and accompanied her to the window. We looked out and saw a handsome, old-fashioned carriage with a troop of couriers and footmen. We saw the slim figure of the pale gentleman in black as he held a thick velvet cloak and placed it about her shoulders, threw the hood over her head. She nodded to him, just touched his hand with hers. He bowed low repeatedly as the door closed and the carriage began to move. She is gone, said Malaka with a sigh. She is gone, I repeated to myself, for the first time in the hurried moments that had elapsed since my consent, reflecting suddenly upon the folly of my act. She did not look up, said the young lady plaintively. The Countess had taken off her mask, perhaps, and did not care to show her face. I said, she could not know that you were in the window. She sighed and looked in my face. She was so beautiful that I relented. I was sorry I had for a moment repented of my hospitality, and I determined to make her amends for the unavowed churlishness of my reception. The young lady, replacing her mask, joined my ward in persuading me to return to the grounds, where the concert was soon to be renewed. We did so, and walked up and down the terrace that lies under the castle windows. Millarca became very intimate with us, and amused us with lively descriptions and stories of most of the great people whom we saw upon the terrace. I liked her more and more every minute. A gossip without being ill-natured was extremely diverting to me, who had been so long out of the great world. I thought what life she would give to our sometimes lonely evenings at home. This ball was not over until the morning sun had almost reached the horizon. It pleased the Grand Duke to dance till then, so loyal people could not go away or think of bed. We just got through a crowded saloon when my ward asked me what had become of Millarca. I thought she'd been by her side, and she fancied she was by mine. The fact was, we lost her. All my efforts to find her were vain. I feared that she had mistaken, in the confusion of a momentary separation from us, other people for her new friends, and had possibly pursued and lost them in the extensive grounds, which were thrown open to us. Now, in its full force, I recognised a new folly in my having undertaken the charge of a young lady, without so much as knowing her name, and fettered as I was by promises of the reasons for imposing which I knew nothing. Could not even point my inquiries by saying that the missing young lady was the daughter of the Countess, who had taken her departure a few hours before. Morning broke. It was clear daylight before I gave up my search. It was not till near 2 o'clock next day that we heard anything of my missing charge. At about that time a servant knocked at my niece's door to say that he had been earnestly requested by a young lady who appeared to be in great distress to make out where she could find the General Baron Spielsdorf and the young lady his daughter, in whose charge she had been left by her mother. She told my poor child a story to account for her having failed to recover us for so long. Very late, she said, she had got to the housekeeper's bedroom in despair of finding us, and had then fallen into a deep sleep, which, as long as it was, had hardly sufficed to recruit her strength after the fatigues of the ball. That day Millarca came home with us. I was only too happy, after all, to have secured so charming a companion for my dear girl. Chapter 13. And significant tea. And a brief stretch break.
You alright?
Yeah, I'm good.
Your leg falling asleep?
A little bit. And we're back. Chapter 13. The Woodsman. There soon, however, appeared some drawbacks. In the first place, Millarca complained of extreme languor, the weakness that remained after a late illness, and she never emerged from her room till the afternoon was pretty far advanced. In the next place, it was accidentally discovered, although she always locked her door on the inside and never disturbed the key from its place till she admitted the maid, that she was undoubtedly sometimes absent from her room in the very early morning, and at various times later in the day, because she wished it to be understood, before she wished it to be understood, and that she was stirring. She was repeatedly seen from the windows of the Schloss in the first faint grey of the morning, walking through the trees in an easterly direction, looking like a person in a trance. This convinced me that she walked in her sleep, but this hypothesis did not solve the puzzle. How did she pass out from her room, leaving the door locked on the inside? How did she escape from the house without unbarring door or window? In the midst of my perplexities, an anxiety of a far more urgent kind presented itself. My dear child began to lose her looks and health, and that in a manner so mysterious and even horrible that I became thoroughly frightened. She was at first visited by appalling dreams, then, as she fancied, by a spectre, sometimes resembling Millarca, sometimes in the shape of a beast indistinctly seen, walking round the foot of her bed from side to side. Lastly came sensations, one not unpleasant, but very peculiar, she said, resembled the flow of an icy stream against her breast. At a later time, she felt something like a pair of large needles pierce her, a little below the throat, with a very sharp pain. A few nights after, following a gradual and convulsive sense of strangulation, then came unconsciousness. I could hear distinctly every word the kind old general was saying, because by this time we were driving upon the short grass that spreads on either side of the road as you approach the roofless village which had not shown the smoke of a chimney for more than half a century. You may guess how strangely I felt as I heard my own symptoms so exactly described in those which had been experienced by the poor girl who, but for the catastrophe which follows, would have been at that moment a visitor at my father's chateau. You may suppose also how I felt as I heard him detail habits and mysterious peculiarities which were in fact those of our beautiful guest, Carmilla. A vista opened in the forest. We were all of a sudden under the chimneys and gables of the ruined village and the towers and battlements of the dismantled castle, round which gigantic trees are grouped, overhung us from a slight eminence. In a frightened dream I got down from the carriage, and in silence, for we had each abundant matter for thinking, we soon mounted the ascent, and were among the spacious chambers, winding stairs, and dark corridors of the castle. And this was once the palatial residence of the Karnsteins, said the old general at length, as from a great window he looked out across the village and saw the wide, undulating expanse of forest. It was a bad family, and here its blood-stained annals were written. He continued, it is odd that they should, after death, continue to plague the human race with their atrocious lusts. That is the chapel of the Karnsteins, down there. He pointed down to the grey walls of the Gothic building, partly visible through the foliage a little way down the steep. And I hear the axe of a woodman, he added, busy among the trees that surround it. He possibly may give us the information of which I am in search, and point out the grave of Micalla, Countess of Karnstein. These rustics preserve the local traditions of great families, whose stories die out among the rich and titled so soon as the families themselves become extinct. We have a portrait at home of Micalla, the Countess Karnstein. Should you like to see it? Asked my father. Time enough, dear friend, replied the general. I believe that I have seen the original, and one motive which has led me to you earlier than I at first intended was to explore the chapel which we are now approaching. What? See the Countess Micalla? Exclaimed my father. Why, she has been dead more than a century. Not so dead as you fancy, I am told, said the general. I confess, General, you puzzle me utterly, replied my father, looking at him. I fancied for a moment with a return of the suspicion I detected before, but although there was anger and detestation at times in the old general's manner, there was nothing flighty. There remains to me, he said as we passed under the heavy arch of the Gothic church, for its dimensions would have justified its being so styled, but one object which can interest me during the few years that remain to me on earth, and that is to wreak havoc on her the vengeance which I, thank God, may still be accomplished by a mortal arm. What vengeance can you mean? Asked my father in increasing amazement. I mean to decapitate the monster, he answered with a fierce flush and a stamp that echoed mournfully through the hollow ruin, and his clenched hand was at the same moment raised as if it grasped the handle of an axe, while he shook it ferociously in the air. What? Exclaimed my father, more than ever bewildered. To strike her head off. Cut her head off? Aye, with a hatchet, with a spade, with anything that can cleave through her murderous throat. You shall hear, he answered, trembling with rage, and hurrying forward, he said, that beam will answer for a seat. Your dear child is fatigued. Let her be seated, and I will, in a few sentences, close my dreadful story. The squared block of wood, which lay on the grass-grown pavement of the chapel, formed a bench on which I was very glad to seat myself, and in the meantime the general called to the woodman, who had been removing some boughs which leaned upon the old walls, and, axe in hand, the hardy old fellow stood before us. He could not tell us anything of these monuments, but there was an old man, he said, a ranger of this forest, at present sojourning in the house of the priest, about 2 miles away, who could point out every monument of the old Karnstein family, and for a trifle he undertook to bring him back with him if we would lend him one of our horses in little more than half an hour. Have you been long employed about this forest? Asked my father of the old man. I have been a woodman here, he answered in his patois, under the forester all my days. So has my father before me, and so on, as many generations as I can count up. I could show you the very house in the village here at which my ancestors lived. How came the village to be deserted? Asked the general. It was troubled by revenants, sir. Several were trapped to their graves. There detected by the usual tests and extinguished in the usual way, decapitation by the stake and by burning, but not until many of the villagers were killed. But after all those proceedings, according to law, he continued, so many graves opened, so many vampires deprived of their horrible animation, the village was not relieved. But a Moravian nobleman who happened to be travelling this way heard how matters were, and being skilled, as many people are in his country in such affairs, he offered to deliver the village from its tormentor. He did so thus. There being a bright moon that night, he ascended, shortly after sunset, the towers of the chapel here, from whence he could distinctly see the churchyard beneath him. You can see it from that window. From this point he watched until he saw the vampire come out of his grave, and place near it the linen clothes in which he had been folded, and then glide away towards the village to plague its inhabitants. The stranger, having seen all this, came down from the steeple, took the linen wrappings of the vampire, and carried them up to the top of the tower, which he again mounted. When the vampire returned from his prowlings and missed his clothes, he cried furiously to the Moravian, whom he saw at the summit of the tower, and who, in reply, beckoned him to ascend and take them. Whereupon the vampire, accepting his invitation, began to climb the steeple, and so soon as he had reached the battlements, the Moravian, with a stroke of his sword, clove his skull in twain. Hurling him down to the churchyard, whither, descending by the winding stairs, the stranger followed and cut his head off, and next day delivered it and the body to the villagers, who duly impaled and burnt them. This Moravian nobleman had authority from the then head of the family to remove the tomb of Mircalla, Countess Karnstein, which he did effectually, so that in a little while its site was quite forgotten. Can you point out where it stood? Asked the general eagerly. The forester shook his head and smiled. Not a living soul could tell you that now, he said. Besides, they say her body was removed, but no one is sure of that either. Having thus spoken, as time pressed, he dropped his axe and departed, leaving us to hear the remainder of the general's strange story. And that, folks, is where we're going to take a break for a couple of minutes. Stretch your legs, refresh your water, get a snack if you need one, and we will be back for the exciting conclusion a couple of minutes from now.
You just have to say Sean Bean. People are like, Sean Bean!
Now, where were we? I believe Sean Bean was in the middle of his horror story.
Not being interrupted by the protagonist.
Yes, just like,
sure to be slain by
they're
vampires.
So attentive. Also, when does Dad buy a ticket from the clue store, right? 14. The meeting. My beloved child, he resumed, was now growing rapidly worse. The physician who attended her had failed to produce the slightest impression on her disease, for such I then supposed it to be. He saw my alarm. He suggested a consultation. I called in an abler physician from Graz. Several days elapsed before he arrived. He was a good and pious as well as a learned man. Having seen my poor ward together, they withdrew to my library to confer and discuss. I, from the adjoining room where I awaited their summons, heard these two gentlemen's voices raised in something sharper than a strictly philosophical discussion. I knocked at the door and entered. Found the old physician from Graz maintaining his theory. His rival was combating it with undisguised ridicule, accompanied with bursts of laughter. This unseemly manifestation subsided, and the altercation ended on my entrance. "Sir," said my first physician, "my learned brother seems to think that you want a conjurer and not a doctor." "Pardon me," said the old physician from Graz, looking displeased. "I shall state my own view of the case in my own way another time. I grieve, Monsieur le General, that by my skill and science I can be of no use. Before I go, shall I do myself the honour to suggest something to you?" He seemed thoughtful, and sat down at a table and began to write. Profoundly disappointed, I made my bow, and as I turned to go, the other doctor pointed over his shoulder to his companion, who was writing, and then, with a shrug significantly, touched his forehead. The consultation then left me precisely where I was. Walked out into the grounds, all but distracted. The doctor from Graz in 10 or 15 minutes overtook me. He apologised for having followed me, but said that he could not conscientiously take his leave without a few words more. Told me that he could not be mistaken. No natural disease exhibited the same symptoms, and that death was already very near. There remained, however, a day, or possibly two, of life. If the fatal seizure were at once arrested, with great care and skill, her strength might possibly return, but all hung now upon the confines of the irrevocable. One more assault might extinguish the last spark of vitality, which is every moment ready to die. "And what is the nature of the seizure you speak of?" I entreated. Sorry, wrong voice. "And what is the nature of the seizure you speak of?" I entreated. "I have stated all fully in this note, which I place in your hands upon the distinct condition that you send for the nearest clergyman, and open my letter in his presence, and on no account read it till he is with you. You would despise it else, and it is a matter of life and death. Should the priest fail you, then, indeed, you may read it." He asked me, before taking his leave finally, whether I would wish to see a man curiously learned upon this very subject, which, after I had read his letter, would probably interest me above all others. And he urged me earnestly to invite him to visit him there, and so took his leave. The ecclesiastic was absent. I read the letter by myself. At another time or in another case it might have excited my ridicule, but into what quackeries will not people rush for a last chance, where all accustomed means have failed and the life of a beloved object is at stake? Nothing, you will say, could be more absurd than this learned man's letter. It was monstrous enough to have consigned him to a madhouse. He said that the patient was suffering from the visits of a vampire. The punctures, which he described as having occurred near the throat, were, he insisted, the insertion of those two long, thin and sharp teeth, which, it is well known, are peculiar to vampires, and there could be no doubt, he added, as to the well-defined presence of the small livid mark which all concurred in describing as to that induced by the demon's lips. Every symptom described by the sufferer was in exact conformity with those recorded in every case of a similar visitation. Being myself wholly sceptical as to the existence of any such portent as the vampire, the supernatural theory of the good doctor furnished, in my opinion, but another instance of learning and intelligence oddly associated with some one hallucination. I was so miserable, however, that rather than try nothing, I acted upon the instructions of the letter. I concealed myself in the dark dressing room that opened upon the poor patient's room, in which a candle was burning, and watched there till she was fast asleep. I stood at the door, peeping through the small crevice, my sword laid on the table beside me as my directions prescribed, until, a little after 1, I saw a very large black object, very ill-defined, crawl, as it seemed to me, over the foot of the bed, and swiftly spread itself up to the poor girl's throat, where it swelled in a moment into a great palpitating mass. For a few moments I had stood petrified. I now sprang forward with my sword in my hand. The black creature suddenly contracted towards the foot of the bed, glided over it, and standing on the floor about a yard below the foot of the bed, with a glare of skulking ferocity and horror fixed on me, I saw Millarca. Speculating I know not what, I struck at her instantly with my sword, but I saw her standing near the door, unscathed. Horrified, I pursued and struck again. She was gone, and my sword flew to shivers against the door. I can't describe to you all that passed on that horrible night. The whole house was up and stirring. The spectre Millarca was gone, but her victim was sinking fast, and before the morning dawn she died. The old general was agitated. We did not speak to him. My father walked to some little distance and began reading the inscriptions on the tombstones, and thus occupied he strolled into the door of a side chapel to prosecute his researches. The general leaned against the wall, dried his eyes, sighed heavily. I was relieved on hearing the voices of Carmilla and Madame, who were at that moment approaching. The voices died away. In the solitude, having just listened to so strange a story, connected as it was with the great untitled dead whose monuments were mouldering among the dust and ivy around us, and every incident of which bore so awfully upon my own mysterious case, in this haunted spot, darkened by the towering foliage that rose on every side, dense and high above its noiseless walls, a horror began to steal over me, and my heart sank as I thought that my friends were, after all, not about to enter and disturb this trist and ominous scene. The old general's eyes were fixed on the ground as he leaned with his hand upon the basement of a shattered monument. Under a narrow arched doorway, surmounted by one of those demoniacal grotesques in which the cynical and ghostly fancy of old Gothic carved into lights, I saw very gladly the beautiful face and figure of Carmilla enter the shadowy chapel. I was just about to rise and speak, and nodded, smiling, in answer to her peculiarly engaging smile, when, with a cry, the old man by my side caught up the woodsman's hatchet and started forwards. On seeing him, a brutalized change came over her features. It was an instantaneous and horrible transformation, as she made a crouching step backwards. Before I could utter a scream, he struck at her with all his force, but she dived under his blow, and, unscathed, caught him in her tiny grasp by the wrist. He struggled for a moment to release his arm, but his hand opened, the axe fell to the ground, and the girl was gone. He staggered against the wall, his grey hair stood upon his head, and a moisture shone over his face, as if he were at the point of death. The frightful scene had passed in a moment. The first thing I recollect after is Madame standing before me and impatiently repeating again and again the question, "Where is Mademoiselle Carmilla?" I answered at length, "I don't know, I can't tell. She just went there," and I pointed to the door through which Madame had just entered, only a minute or two since. "But I have been standing there in the passage ever since Mademoiselle Carmilla entered. She did not return." She then began to call Carmilla through every door and passage, and from the windows, but no answer came. "She called herself Carmilla?" asked the general. "Carmilla, yes," I answered. "Aye," he said, "that is Millarca. That is the same person who long ago was called Millarca Countess Karnstein. Depart from this accursed ground, my poor child, as quickly as you can. Drive to the clergyman's house. Stay there till we come. Begone! May you never behold Carmilla no more. You will not find her here. Chapter 15. Ordeal and Execution. As he spoke, one of the strangest looking men I have ever beheld entered the chapel at the door through which Carmilla had made both her entrance and her exit. He was tall, narrow-chested, stooping with high shoulders and dressed in black. His face was brown and dried in with deep furrows. He wore an oddly shaped hat with a broad leaf. His hair, long and grizzled, hung on his shoulders. He wore a pair of gold spectacles and walked slowly with an odd, shambling gait, with his face sometimes turned up to the sky and sometimes bowed down towards the ground, seeming to wear a perpetual smile. His long, thin arms were swinging, his lank hands, in old black gloves ever so much too wide for them, waving and gesticulating in utter abstraction. "The very man!" exclaimed the general, advancing with manifest delight. "My dear Baron, how happy I am to see you! I had no hope of meeting you so soon." He signed to my father, who by this time had returned, and leading the fantastic old gentleman whom he called the Baron to meet him. He introduced him formally, and they at once entered into earnest conversation. The stranger took a roll of paper from his pocket and spread it on the worn surface of a tomb that stood by. He had a pencil case in his fingers, with which he traced imaginary lines from point to point on the paper, which from their often glancing from it together at certain points of the building I concluded to be a plan of the chapel. He accompanied what I may term his lecture with occasional readings from a dirty little book, whose yellow leaves were closely written over. They sauntered together down the side aisle, opposite to the spot where I was standing, conversing as they went. Then they began measuring distances by paces, and finally they all stood together, facing a piece of the side wall, which they began to examine with great minuteness, pulling off the ivy that clung over it, and rapping the plaster with the ends of their sticks, scraping here, knocking there. At length they ascertained the existence of a broad marble tablet, with letters carved in relief upon it. With the assistance of the woodman, who soon returned, a monumental inscription and carved escutcheon were disclosed. They proved to be those of the long-lost monument of Mircalla, Countess Karnstein. The old general, though not, I fear, given to the praying mood, raised his hands and eyes to heaven in mute thanksgiving for some moments. "Tomorrow," I heard him say, "the commissioner will be here, and the Inquisition will be held according to law." Then, turning to the old man with the gold spectacles, whom I have described, he shook him warmly by both hands and said, "Baron, how can I thank you? How could we all thank you? You have delivered this region from a plague that has scourged its inhabitants for more than a century. The horrible enemy, thank God, is at last tracked." My father led the stranger aside, and the general followed. I know that he had led them out of hearing, that he might relate my case, and I saw them glance often quickly at me as the discussion proceeded. My father came to me, kissed me again and again, and leading me from the chapel said, "It is time to return, but before we go home we must add to our party the good priest who lives but a little way from this, and persuade him to accompany us to the Schloss." Whole thing, I've nailed it every time, that's the one time I fail. "And persuade him to accompany us to the Schloss." In this quest we were successful, and I was glad, being unspeakably fatigued when we reached home. But my satisfaction was changed to dismay on discovering that there were no tidings of Carmilla. Of the scene that had occurred in the ruined chapel, no explanation was offered to me, and it was clear that it was a secret which my father, for the present, determined to keep from me. The sinister absence of Carmilla made the remembrance of the scene more horrible. The arrangements for the night were singular. 2 servants and Madame were to sit up in my room that night, and the ecclesiastic with my father kept watch in the adjoining dressing-room. The priest had performed certain solemn rites that night, the purport of which I did not understand any more than I comprehended the reason of this extraordinary precaution taken for my safety during sleep I saw all clearly a few days later. The disappearance of Carmilla was followed by the discontinuance of my nightly sufferings. You have heard, no doubt, of the appalling superstition that prevails in Upper and Lower Styria, in Moravia, Silesia, in Turkish Serbia, in Poland, even in Russia, the superstition, so we must call it, of the vampire. If human testimony, taken with every care and solemnity judicially before commissions innumerable, each consisting of many members, all chosen for integrity and intelligence, and constituting reports more voluminous perhaps than exist upon any one other class of cases, is worth anything, it is difficult to deny or even to doubt the existence of such a phenomenon as the vampire. For my part, I have heard no theory by which to explain what I myself have witnessed and experienced, other than that supplied by the ancient and well-attested belief of the country. The next day, the formal proceedings took place in the chapel of Karnstein. The grave of the Countess Makala was opened, and the general and my father recognized each his perfidious and beautiful guest in the face now disclosed to view. The features, though 150 years old, had passed since the funeral, were tinted with the warmth of light. Her eyes were open. No cadaverous smell exhaled from the coffin. The two medical men, one officially present, the other on the part of the promoter of the inquiry, attested the marvellous fact that there was a faint but appreciable respiration and a corresponding action of the heart. The limbs were perfectly flexible, the flesh elastic, the leaden coffin floated with blood, in which, to a depth of 7 inches, the body lay immersed. Here, then, were all the admitted signs and proofs of vampirism. The body, therefore, in accordance with the ancient practice, was raised, and a sharp stake driven through the heart of the vampire, who uttered a piercing shriek at the moment, in all respects such as might escape from a living person in the last agony. Then the head was struck off, and a torrent of blood flowed from the severed neck. The body and head was next placed on a pile of wood, and reduced to ashes, which were thrown upon the river and borne away, and that territory has never since been plagued by the visits of a vampire. My father has a copy of the report of the Imperial Commission, with the signatures of all who were present in these proceedings, attached in verification of the statement. It is from this official paper that I have summarized my account of this last shocking scene. Conclusion. I write all this, you suppose, with composure. Far from it. I cannot think of it without agitation. Nothing but your earnest desire, so repeatedly expressed, could have induced me to sit down to a task that has unstrung my nerves for months to come, and reinduced a shadow of the unspeakable horror, years after my deliverance, that has continued to make my days and nights dreadful, and solitude insupportably terrifying. Let me add a word or two about that quaint Baron Vordenberg, to whose curious lore we were indebted for the discovery of the Countess Makala's grave. He had taken up his abode in Graz, where, living upon a mere pittance, which was all that remained to him of the once princely estates of his family in Upper Styria, he devoted himself to the minute and laborious investigation of the marvellously authenticated tradition of vampirism. He had at his fingers' ends all the great and little works upon the subject. Magia Postuma, Phlegon de Mirabilis, Augustinus de Cura per Mortuis, Philosophicae et Christianae Cogitationes de Vampiris by John Christopher Harenberg, and 1,000 others, among which I remember only a few of those which he lent to my father. He had a voluminous digest of all the judicial cases, from which he had extracted a system of principles that appeared to govern, some always and others occasionally only, the condition of the vampire. I may mention in passing that the deathly pallor attributed to that sort of revenants is a mere melodramatic fiction. They present in the grave, and when they show themselves in human society, the appearance of healthy life. When disclosed to light in their coffins, they exhibit all the symptoms that are enumerated as those which proved the vampire life of the long-dead Countess Karstein. How they escape from their graves and return to them for certain hours every day, without displacing the clay or leaving any trace of disturbance in the state of the coffin or the cerements, has always been admitted to be utterly inexplicable. The amphibious existence of the vampire is sustained by daily renewed slumber in the grave. Its horrible lust for living blood supplies the vigor of its waking existence. The vampire is prone to be fascinated with an engrossing vehemence resembling the passion of love. The vampire is prone to be fascinated with an engrossing vehemence resembling the passion of love by particular persons. In pursuit of these, it will exercise inexhaustible patience and stratagem, for access to a particular object may be constructed in 100 ways. It will never desist until it has satiated its passion and drained the very life of its coveted victim. But it will, in these cases, husband and protract its murderous enjoyment with the refinement of an epicure, and heighten to it by the gradual approaches of an artful courtship. In these cases, it seems to yearn for something like sympathy and consent. In ordinary ones, it goes direct to its object, overpowers with violence, and strangles and exhausts, often at a single feast. The vampire is apparently subject, in certain situations, to special conditions. In the particular instance of which I have given you a relation, Makala seemed to be limited to a name which, if not her real one, should at least reproduce, without the omission or addition of a single letter, those, as we say, anagrammatically, which compose it. Carmilla did this. So did Malaka. My father related to the Baron Vordenberg, who remained with us for 2 or 3 weeks after the expulsion of Carmilla, the story about the Moravian nobleman and the vampire at Karnstein churchyard. And then he asked the Baron how he had discovered the exact position of the long-concealed tomb. The Baron's grotesque features puckered up into a mysterious smile. He looked down, still smiling on his worn spectacle case, and fumbled with it. Then, looking up, he said, "I have many journals and other papers written by that remarkable man. The most curious among them is one treating of the visit of which you speak to Karnstein. The tradition, of course, discolors and distorts a little. He might have been termed a Moravian nobleman, for he had changed his abode to that territory, and was beside a noble. But he was, in truth, a native of Upper Styria. It is enough to say that in very early youth he had been a passionate and favoured lover of the beautiful Makala, Countess of Karnstein. Her early death plunged him into inconsolable grief. It is the nature of vampires to increase and multiply, but according to an ascertained and ghostly law. Assume, at starting, a territory perfectly free from that pest. How does it begin? How does it multiply itself? I will tell you. A person, more or less wicked, puts an end to himself. A suicide, under certain circumstances, becomes a vampire. That spectre visits living people in their slumbers. They die, and almost invariably, in the grave, develop into vampires. This happened in the case of the beautiful Makala, who was haunted by one of these demons. My ancestor, Vordenberg, whose title I still bear, soon discovered this, and in the course of the studies to which he devoted himself, learned a great deal more. Among other things, he concluded that suspicion of vampirism would probably fall, sooner or later, upon the dead countess, who in life had been his idol. He conceived a horror, be she what she might, of her remains being profaned by the outrage of a posthumous execution. He has left a curious paper to prove that the vampire, on its expulsion from its amphibious existence, is projected into a far more horrible life, and he resolved to save his once beloved Makala from this. He adopted the stratagem of a journey here, a pretended removal of her remains, a real obliteration of her monument. When age had stolen upon him, and from the veil of years he looked back on the scenes he was leaving, he considered, in a different spirit. What he had done, and horror took possession of him. He made the tracings and notes which have guided me to this very spot, and drew up a confession of the deception that he had practiced. If he had intended any further action in this matter, death prevented him, and the hand of a remote descendant has, too late for many, directed the pursuit to the lair of the beast. We talked a little more, and among other things he said was this. One sign of the vampire is the power of the hand. The slender hand of Makala closed like a vice of steel on the general's wrist when he raised the hatchet to strike, but its power is not confined to its grasp. It leaves a numbness in the limb it seizes, which is slowly, if ever, recovered from. The following spring, my father took me a tour through Italy. We remained away for more than a year. It was long before the terror of recent events subsided, and to this hour the image of Carmilla returns to memory with ambiguous alternations. Sometimes the playful, languid, beautiful girl, sometimes the writhing fiend I saw in the ruined church. And often from a reverie I have started, fancying I heard the light step of Carmilla at the drawing room door. And that is that. So, it doesn't quite all begin with Carmilla. In actuality, it all began, in the West at any rate, on the same night that Frankenstein's monster was shocked into life. Polidori's The Vampire was written as part of the same challenge, and was by all accounts a very clearly real-life fanfiction insert of Lord Byron, also there that night. Personally, I think there's a parallel universe where AO3 was invented as part of that challenge, and one day I'd love to visit. I bet they have dirigibles. But Carmilla was the first vampire story to really connect, and as we can see, also the first time vampirism and eroticism were tied together quite so closely, as well as the very notion of sexual identity. There's a lot to be said about that, and about how the Victorian mores of the story require Le Fanu to be quite so circumspect. Pressures of the time being what they are, he could only imply instead of explore. His successors, very much a different story, and in many cases often not a good one. You see, very nearly every version of Dracula is about sex. And the subtext is very, very, very often just text. There's a lot to be said about the radically different gender politics of gay vampires and female-identifying gay vampires being viewed as the extreme or the titillating, while male cishet vampires get to do whatever they want. If you want to take a look at that issue and the way it and the issue of race and horror fold around one another, I'll throw a couple of links in the show notes. The one I'd especially recommend is Horror Noir on Shudder, which is the history of black horror cinema, and it is extremely great. Plus, it's also worth remembering, while Carmilla is a tragic figure, certainly in this metatextual way, when we see that she's still confined to the sidelines, she's really bad at staying there. Like all great monsters, Carmilla never quite dies. She's resurfaced in multiple anime. This entire novel has been rewritten by David Bryan, who credits Le Fanu as a co-writer on Carmilla, The Wolves of Styria. And most recently, back in 2002, The Moth Diaries by Rachel Klein is in many ways another arrangement of the story, played on different instruments, but still very much this tune.
There are vampires named Carmilla all over the place.
Yes, there's movie versions of this are surprisingly regular as well. Carmilla still haunts vampire fiction, and oddly vampire hunter fiction too. Dr. Hecelius, mentioned in the briefest of passing instances here, is the frame and occasional character for 4 other stories, which are collected in At Last Darkly, which in turn is a phrase that's echoed down genre fiction almost as long as the haunted, desperate, woman-shaped creature at the core of this story, and the sense of growing dread that defines both it and her. So, this was Carmilla. The Turn of the Screw, Dracula, countless other pillars of contemporary horror owe her a debt of gratitude. Let's just hope they never invite her in. This was really fun. Thanks for listening.
It's a lovely day in the village and you are a horrible vampire.
Honkpire. So, the interesting thing about all of this, before we step across to the shenanigans, is this actually runs us out the other side of the stuff that we had planned.
Mm-hmm.
And what we'd really like you to do is, if you like this, or if there's stuff that you'd like to hear from us, please get in contact, whether it's through the chat or on Twitter. You'll find our contact details in the show notes for this. And if there's anything that you'd like us to take a look at or like me to talk about, let me know. I'm quite up for doing the other Professor Hecelia stories. I think that might be really good fun for one. But we have a bunch of ideas, and we'd love to hear some more from you.
Yeah, basically, we're looking for more ideas about streams Alasdair can do on Rusty Quill, because this was a big, long story, and stories are fun, but people might want to do other things.
Yes, there is also this.
Speaking of other things,
there is also the small point that they never explain the mother figure.
Yeah, is she in two bodies at once? Is the guy in the black cape like the husband of the original Countess?
Is she like a networked life form or something?
It's very very hand wavy.
So let's do some shenanigans.
We have one little fun one, and then the one you're all actually here for. And Topaz sent this to us. Go ahead.
Okay. Topaz, thank you very much for the spot on this. This is from a Tumblr called Sarcasm and Stuff, which I believe is Topaz's own. And comes in via another Tumblr, Curious Corvids. And this is Fear Avatars as Troubled Birds. Jonathan Sims. I have a natural talent for being irrational. Elias Bouchard. He had a violent, uncontrolled temper which sent him literally insane when he was annoyed. But he was good looking. Peter Lucas. I do not go to my happy place. I go to my high, lonesome place. Michael. Things just got super weird. It's my time to shine. Helen. She secretly longed for hugs at work. Jane Prentice. I'm human phobic. Jared Hopworth. Oh Jesus. Oh my God. Nicola Ursinov. My only crime was that I was down to clown. Simon Fairchild. My crazy runs wide and it runs deep. Mike Crew. My modus operandi is dial up the awesome and break the knob off. Oliver Banks. Anxiety and caffeine are having a cockfight in my brain. Jude Perry. Her withering side eye was always melting her mascara.
Oh, poor Jude.
Annabelle Kane. I would look into your soul, but I've already devoured it. Agnes Montague. A financially unstable mess, but at the liquor store they call me Mom.
Oh my God.
I do like that one. Bonus, Jerry Key. That's a crazy idea. Insane. It doesn't make sense. You'll do it? Of course, I replied. Bonus, Mary Key. I preen for Satan. Okay.
All right. So let me introduce this. So it's his birthday, and I wanted to do something fun because we can't travel and we can't go anywhere. So when you think of fun with the Rusty Quill folks, you of course think of Tim Meredith. And so I approached Tim and said, hey, it's Alasdair's birthday and he's going to be on RQ streams. Could you say happy birthday to Alasdair? And Tim went above and beyond.
Who knew?
And he sent a song. And what we're going to do now, go ahead and switch the screen here, is we're now going to play the birthday song for Alasdair. Start your clips, and you can all watch Alasdair react to the song. And I'm going to make this screen a little bit bigger so that Alasdair can watch Alasdair react to the song, and so I can push all the buttons, because this is going to be hilarious, and we're not going to be able to get through this without laughing. So,
okay.
All right, everybody ready? Gosh, I hope this works. I've tried very hard to make sure this works. Okay.
Okay.
Cross your fingers. Here we go. Alright.
Raise your hands, a clapping action employ.
Nope, that's not working. Stop. Stop. Why are you not working? Oh, I have to fix a setting. Sorry, everybody, give me just a second. I know. Okay. Let me try that again. Hopefully this is gonna work.
Raise your hands, a clapping action employ. For the man of the hour so filled with joy. Smoke clears, you see.
I'm going to enjoy this so.
Growing up in the Isle of Man, he will leave just as soon as he out of can. Gain the powers, island tea magic and science. Playing rugby at a national level, bouncing clubs with fists as fast as the devil. But there's more, so much more in his mind. Science fiction, horror, fantasy, 3-time Hugo Award nominee. There's not much that this boy can't do. It's Alasdair Stew. 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 Alasdair Stew. Happy birthday to you.
You're welcome.
Oh,
That's what I've had stuck in my head for the last 2 days, and I haven't been able to hum or whisper or say a thing. Yeah.
I love you.
Oh, can you breathe? Are you okay?
Oh my. Oh.
So yes, that was Tim's fault. We'll drop some links for you in the chat now once you can breathe. Here,
Okay,
take over the camera.
I'm good. I'm good.
Are you sure?
I'm good.
I'm gonna play it again on you later. You realize?
I know. Oh, I've been shenanigans.
Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yes, you have.
Oh.
So I'm gonna put some links in the chat for where you can give some love to Tim.
Please do.
Are you alright?
Yes, I am. That was amazing. He's
Breathe.
good grief. Good
Cause of death
grief.
shenanigans.
I'm fine.
Yes,
I'm fine.
absolutely.
Honestly, don't worry.
And Tim, I'm hoping will very much put this up on SoundCloud so that you can all have it stuck in your head like I have. For the
Oh
last couple
God,
of
this
days.
is going to be play-out music for the full load.
Oh no! Oh, are you alright?
I'm good. I'm great.
Okay. Happy birthday, sweetie!
Thank you. Right. On that bombshell, I'm
Breathe.
together. Massive thanks to everybody who donates to the Rusty Quill, because when you donate, things like that happen. I have been and ever shall be
Your friend!
Alasdair Stuart. Some of you may know me from the Magnus Archives as Peter Lucas, Martin's nightclub entrepreneur, best friend, and former homicide detective. The Rusty Quill is an entertainment company and podcast network focusing on audio drama. They create 3 weekly podcasts: the Magnus Archives, RQ Gaming, and Stellar Firma, all of which are fantastic. Thank you. You can support us by direct donation, by subscribing right here on Twitch, via Patreon, or by telling your friends. You know what? Do all of them. It's great. Do all.
Rustyke, Derek Love, Rustyke, Derek Love, Rustyke, Derek Love, Rustyke, Derek Love, Rustyke, Derek Love.
Cool.
I have no idea what that is. I'm guessing it's love.
Go say hi on the Discord server as well. There's some lovely people on there. Go hang out. You're probably going to wonder where you can find me, because I'm not always here. I'm having trouble forming words. No, it's fine. They're in front of me.
Alasdair Stew! I'm going to be singing that at you for a long time. It's going to be great.
This coming Sunday.
I'm sending it to your mom.
Yes, you are. Yes, you should. This coming Sunday at 10 a.m., Marguerite and I will be continuing to perpetrate geese crimes. on the Untitled Goose Game, which now has a 2-player co-op. Double honks, double bonks. You want to get in on this. Then Wednesday at 10 p.m. we will be continuing with Ursula Vernon's fantastic The Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking. You can also find me on Twitter at Alasdair Stuart, Marguerite on Twitter at Legal Valkyrie. I have a weekly pop culture newsletter called The Full Lid, which publishes every Friday at 5 p.m. Hype train is apparently incoming.
Okay.
And you can find full details for how to sign up for that, as well as an archive, as well as a bunch of other stuff, over at my my website, alasdairstuart.com.
Shame on you! I'm trying to put your Twitter link in the thing, and I'm being completely distracted because there are noises being made.
It's fine. It's all good.
It up too loud.
It's all good. They're good noises. It's fine. You can next see something on the RQ streams on Saturday at 4 p.m. when Mike will return to Skyrim and the adventures of Gary Catman. Thank you all so much. This was Tim especially. This was fantastic. I need to sit down. I think I already am.
Down.
That was fast. And have a fantastic evening. And I will see you on Sunday. Bye.